Alright, so this is a Chevy 31X. Let's see, what the hell year is this? A of 21. Leveling kit. Skyjacker. Okay. You get bolts. You get these spacers. You got metric bolts for 10.9, and you get 4 washers and 4 nuts. I don't know why I'm doing this video, but whatever. I just had a thought. So I drove it up on ramps, and I'm using a 15 to undo the strut bolts on the bottom lower control arm, and I have an idea. Bulge, I don't even know if this will work. And no, it's not safe, so do not try this at home. Have a professional do it. Okay. So I took out one bolt. All right. Here's the cheap thing that they use. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's lowering down. And not a lot. And that's probably because the sway bar is still hooked up. So, what I'm going to do is install the bolt, just a couple of threads here. And I got this jack, the wheels are off the ramps, okay? So, lower it a little bit at a time. Make sure the threads, you can look at the threads in that speed nut or whatever, and can pretty much determine when the tire is going to drop or when the suspension relaxes. Let's see what happens. Why not, right? Okay, bolts out. Both bolts are out on this side. That one's half out. And the second one on the right side, which would be the passenger side, that's out. Now there looks to be half-inch gap. Okay. Let me go get my pry bar. I'm going to take the bolt that's already halfway out over here. See what happens. It lowers a little bit more. Look at that. Imagine that. So now I'm probably 3/4 of an inch off the control arm. I swear, these clips just are probably the hardest thing about this whole job. Now I've never done this before on one of these, so I'm just kind of making it up as I go. Okay. See? So. Take some finger strength, okay, and it looks like you may have to remove other items. I don't know, just kind of work with it here, kind of just filling in the blanks as I go. So I'm putting the bolt through the top of the strut mount, and I got the extender underneath it. So it looks like the reason why you have to disconnect everything, and which is no big deal, it's just I'm trying to do it a different way here, is because the bolt gets in the way of the constant velocity joint, the outer joint boot. Now, you could put it in upside down, okay, but that you run into a problem if you do that. One is whenever you have a bolt in a frame or suspension or just the natural movement of the vehicle, you want it to where, if this was upside down, there's two reasons. If this was upside down and the nut came loose, you got no bolt. All right. Another thing is, if you put it up, you got to make sure that this doesn't get in the way of suspension travel, another joint, CV axle. So if I were to put this up, okay, it may damage the boot through the suspension travel, okay? So it looks like what we're going to have to do is, at the very least, undo the upper ball joint and maybe take off the tire. When you do that, you have to make sure that the ABS wire, okay, so a lot of people forget about the ABS wire, and they let all this suspension relax and drop, and it pulls that ABS, let's see here, it pulls that ABS cord, and it ends up, you know, tugging it and pulling the connector out or damaging the wire or whatever. And that looks like a 17. I might be able to get it from here. Undoing the actual joint from the spindle may be an issue, but again, let me just see what I can do. Let's see if this 11/16 swivel socket will, probably an 18. Yep, 18. What do you know? So I got a 18 on a swivel, 10-inch extension. There you go. Let's try this. And realistically, this is taking more time than it normally would, because if I were just to jack up the vehicle, take the tires off, all this would be exposed, okay? And I probably could have already had it replaced by now. Seven eighths is 22, I think. Yeah. So I use a socket. It has a plastic sleeve so it doesn't mar the paint or chip it. So it comes in handy for such an occasion like, I don't know, new vehicle. Disconnected, upper control arm is disconnected, everything rotates out of the way. Should just did this to begin with. Put your little spacer, put your bolt, okay. See if the holes line up. Okay, so here's what's going on. So it's a little bit twisted, which is to be expected. I mean, you are kind of stressing the suspension a little. let's try this. Since it's a tighter fit, let's try using that bolt to line up the mount. There we go. So I use the one bolt as a guide. And that fits. There is a right way and wrong way to put a washer on. Okay, washers are stamped. They have a rounded side and a squared side. So when I tighten something down with an impact, I just double check it with my hands, make sure that my internal torque wrench is happy with what it was tightened to. Let's relocate the spindle where it needs to be. Use your hand strength to hold the spindle and the upper control arm. Tighten to German torque specifications, good and tight, which usually means for this type of setup, this is a nut washer. You run it down, okay, to the nut, clamps the two assemblies together, meaning the spindle and the upper control arm. Tighten it just to where it seats, and then quarter turn. All right. Put your ABS back in position. It is actually touching the CV boot, okay? Now, on these leveling kits, you're going to have issues like that. What do I mean? So, F-150, their spindle actually contacts the coil spring on the strut. But when you put the weight of the vehicle on it, this control arm straightens out, which in turn, because this is at an angle, it pushes the spindle away from the spring. On this, you have that. Okay? The boot is actually riding on where the strut mounts to the lower control arm. Okay? Will that go away? I don't know. We're going to have to find out. Now, here's what it would be if you were just to take off the front tire. Instead of trying to do something lazy and ultimately longer, you know, my father-in-law, he had a bunch of sayings. One of them was, the lazy work twice as hard, and if it's too easy to do something, you're doing it wrong. Those are words to live by. you can apply them basically in anything you do. Anyways, I don't even know why I started making videos. Takes long to do. People tend to have a better idea, which is fine. I don't care if they got a better idea or not. But when I do care is when they try and force their opinions on you. Then I start to get a little aggravated. Like it's their way or the highway. So. Again, taking the top ball joint off moves the spindle out of the way, rotates the center line of the CV axle away from that bolt, so the bolt will clear. So you can get it in place. Now, usually what happens is when you go to the opposite side, something happens, or you can't get it to go like the other side, which seems to be the case over here. So you just gotta use the power of manipulation to just force things out of the way. Not too much, of course, but just enough to get what you need. It's maybe not what you want or desired, but it's what you need. Where's my wrench? I thought I got everything. I did get everything. $17mm wrench. And if you wanted to do it easier, you can also do that. Okay? Probably safer to do that way also. Seated, quarter turn. ABS. Sorry, I had the bottom going to the top and top going to the bottom. Brake pad sensor. Those two hooked up. That's tight. Okay. Those two have been checked. CV boot is hitting. I'm going to put the tire on. Let the weight of the vehicle on the suspension. And actually before that I'm going to explain something. From the factory, the alignment is not perfect. It's an assembly line. So usually that means that it has been set up in a way that is one, feels good for the driver, and two, is easy to accomplish. I have seen them take measurements from the outer surface of the rotor to the brake line with a tape measure, okay, front wheel drive Chevys, and there's exactly a 1-inch difference between the smaller sedans front wheel drives to the mid-size sedans front wheel drive. Back wheels are chalked, in case anyone's wondering. Let me just see if the, all right, still in, still focus 2, yep, still recording. No, adding extensions doesn't change the torque. The only time the torque changes is if your lever gets longer. Now, one thing I want to go over and actually check right now here, see if that boot is away. Looks like it. What am I doing? Oh, I see light. And it clears. Ever so slightly, but it clears. Now, if you do off-roading, now, when I say off-roading, that can either mean you go up a curb or major off-roading. Let's see here. shoot, I can't get the angle of the dangle. We have space. Okay, we got clearance. All right. So, getting back to the off-road. Any kind of off-road, you run the risk of those hitting. Okay, the CV boot hitting the lower strut mount. Okay, so that said, yeah, okay, I'm done. This video's taking way too long. Quick thing on alignment. When you do these leveling kits, a lot of people say, oh, you don't need an alignment, that is bullshit. They're just trying to sell you something. Look, you need an alignment, okay? Let me explain why. This arm right here, you got your inner socket. Okay, it's not an inner tie rod, it's called an inner socket. You got your lock nut and your outer tie rod. Okay? From the factory, they're straight. This, because you lifted it, is now angled down. However, ever so slightly, the down angle is, your tires are now more towed in. Because the more drastic that angle gets, it's going to start pulling in that tire. Okay? And from the factory, getting to my earlier point, they tow these in. Okay, so the wheels are kind of towed in. The right side is the front face of the tire on the right side of the vehicle, passenger side, is towed towards the center of the vehicle as viewed from the front. Driver side face of the tire, as viewed from the front, is pointed towards the center of the vehicle. Okay? What that does, wears tires. Okay? Wears tires, but gives you a tight sense in steering. Okay? The more 0 degree you have in tow, the more closer to 0. From a towed in perspective, the looser the steering gets, less wear on the tires. Once you get past that point where now you're a positive tow, okay, because as you go down the road, tires turning, road resistance, friction, the tire is going to naturally try and force its way out, okay? It's going to naturally pull out, which is still not enough to overcome the negative tow or tow in. Okay. So what do? It's not that big of an angle. Will it wear the tires faster? Yes, of course. What I will do is I will take a point of reference from the back tire to the front tire. I will eclipse the tire. Okay. I will eclipse the sidewall of the tire. See how it does that? See? Lined up. Straight. See how the rear sidewall pulls away from the front? I will do that and see what reference it is to the rear. Now some vehicles are not off center, but dog-legged. Most GMs have a more narrower rear end than where their front sits, and there's ways to get around that. I will measure, mark the tire, take the point of reference off that tire as viewed from the opposite side, because you want to be over there, and you want to eclipse this with these two sidewalls, and you'll mark the tire, and you'll do your alignments that way. And usually I'll put a baking sheet underneath the tire so it'll turn the steering wheel, or that it'll turn the wheel without turning the steering wheel. I'll lock the steering wheel. But anyways, on something like this, I already know what the alignment's going to be. I've done one of them. So yeah, I already know where to set that jam nut. I guess you just kind of pick up things over the years. But anyways, yeah, I've done more than one. I've done two, so I know where that jam nut goes. And then I'll test drive and adjust accordingly. Okay. So I'll mark it. I'll make sure the joint's in a neutral position. Mark it straight across. Loosen the jam nut. Increase the toe just a tad. Make sure the joint is neutral position. Make sure the boot isn't twisted, okay, because that can happen if you move that, if you rotate that inner socket joint, okay, it can twist that boot if that's actually doing its job, that clamp. It's called a constant tension clamp. It is not a worm gear clamp, okay. And then you got T-bolt clamps, and then you got sure grip clamps. And then you have clamps that actually get tighter with temperature that actually has a stack of washers underneath the head, and we'll get that to another video. But anyways, clamp is not a clamp. There's all kinds of clamps, and you should never use a worm gear clamp. And I'm just going to put this out there while we're talking about clamps. You should never use a worm gear clamp on fuel, okay? And you should never use a worm gear type clamp on coolant hoses. What? What are worm gear clamps good for? Nothing. Okay? Nothing. Worm gear clamps are cheap, and to the do-it-yourselfer, good enough. Not good enough for me. I use heat shrink clamps, which are very good. Constant tension clamps, some call them spring clamps, which is not correct. Constant tension clamps, which are good. T-bolt clamps, which are really good because they hold. And of course, heat adjusted clamps. Anyways, so that's where I'm at. Oh, and then you got your crimp type clamp, which I usually use on fuel. God, too much information. I should just keep it simple. Till next time.